Who write the Bible? Part 1. Introduction. Searching for God's path. In my early 20s, I have started my journey of exploring the world. I have visited many countries around the world and learned about many different cultures and customs. I was shocked by the extent difference between the religions. I saw the Buddhist monks distancing themselves from the worldly life and devoting themselves to worshipping their god, Buddha. I saw the Christian monks isolating themselves in the monasteries and devoting themselves to worshipping their God, Jesus Christ. I saw those who worship trees, stones, cows, mice, fire, money, and other inanimate objects, and I saw those who do not believe in the existence of God or they do believe in the existence of God. But they say, we do not know anything about him. I like to hear from each one his point of view about what he worships. I found that Buddhists believe that Buddhism is the straight path, and the other religions are the path of error. And Christians believe that worshipping Christ and following the gospel is the way of salvation, and atheists do not believe in the existence of paradise or fire. The global statistics indicate that there are around 2 billion Buddhists around the world, 2 billion Christians around the world, 2 billion Muslims around the world, and millions of atheists around the world. Hence, since not all of these religions may be true religions, so only one of them is right, and the others are false. The Creator God of this universe is only one God, and the religion he sent to people is only one religion. Religion means the path to God, and the path to the one God is only one path, which is to worship him alone without associating to him any partner and not to add any innovation to his religion. Who is this God, the Creator, and what is his true religion? Before taking a road by car, you should first make sure that it is the right direction, otherwise, losing time, effort, and money without any meaning. By the same token, in this worldly life, we must first make sure that we are on the right path leading to the house of bliss in the hereafter. Did Buddhist monks make sure before they devote their lives to worshipping Buddha that they are on the right path? Or they just spent their lives uselessly in following a religion that is not the true religion of the Creator? Did Christian monks make sure before they devote their lives to monasticism and to worshipping Christ that this is the way of salvation and that their Bible is the real word of the Creator? Did atheists make sure that there is no God of the universe and the universe came out of nothing or the universe had created itself, and neither there is death, nor heaven, nor fire? And the virtue is equal to the vice, and the criminal who had not been held accountable for his crimes in the worldly life will not also be held accountable after his death. To answer these questions, I tried through this book to help those who search for truth, focusing primarily on Christianity due to its many followers. Since Christianity, its doctrine, and teachings are based on the Bible, we should first ascertain the origin and truthfulness of the Bible. Is the Bible the real word of the Creator, or is it the word of ordinary human beings and the Christians sanctified it? The importance of the Bible. The importance of the Bible stems from many factors. 1. It has around 2 billion Christian followers around the world. 2. On it, the Church has established its foundation stone and doctrine, and through it, it charted a path towards salvation. 3. On it, the Church has established its version about Jesus' life and the incidents that took place with him. 4. Some world leaders and members of parliaments may cite passages from it in international conferences or parliamentary sessions. 5. Some state leaders may cite passages from it to declare war or to conclude a peace agreement. 6. Some priests may rely on it to prove their views regarding gay marriage, whether with permitting or prohibition. 7. Morning Q in Christian country schools starts by reading quotations from the Bible for the children. Christians believe that the first 5 books, Pentateuch, of the Old Testament were written by Prophet Moses. And the rest of the books of the Old Testament were written by the prophets who came after him, and the Old Testament since the time of Moses never been changed or lost at any time. Christians also believe that the 4 Gospels of the New Testament were written by the disciples of Jesus, who were eyewitnesses to the incidents. And the Church has conclusive evidence that those 4 Gospels were written by them. Christians also believe that these 4 Gospels were written by inspiration from the Holy Spirit and that they are God's word, not a human word. Christians also believe that these Gospels were written in the land of the incidents, Palestine, and that the original copies of these Gospels exist and are kept in the Church's library. Christians also believe that Jesus had no Gospel with him during his life on earth. Therefore, we will discuss, God willing, the points that Christians believe in regarding the Bible in the coming chapters. Author. Chapter 1. Irenaeus, Polycarp, Papias. These 3 names are the keywords to know who wrote the 4 Gospels. These 3 names are the basis of the ecclesiastical tradition in attributing the 4 Gospels to the disciples of Christ. Ecclesiastical tradition, what has come to the present Church of the writings of the early Church Fathers. Irenaeus. The Church has little information about him, his personality, and his life. Nevertheless, the Church claims that he was the Bishop of Lyon, France, born in 140 CE and died in 203 CE. But the year of his birth and also the year of his death is controversial and probably unknown. He likely born in Asia Minor from Greek parents, but the place of birth is also disputed. Irenaeus was the first to confront other Christian groups, calling them heresies, such as Gnosticism and Montanism. He studied Greek poetry, language, and philosophy. The Church calls him the father of ecclesiastical tradition, and also the father of Christian theology. He is the first to lay the foundation of Christian theology and Christian doctrine. He is the primary and only source on which the Church relies to prove that the Gospel scribes are the disciples of Christ. He was the first to point out that the scribes of the Gospels are the disciples of Christ in his book, Against Heresies, written in 180 CE. Eusebius of Caesarea, 260–339, who lived between the 3rd and 4th centuries and was called the father of ecclesiastical history because of his work in recording the history of the early Church, in his book, Church History, stated that Irenaeus has mentioned in his book, Against Heresies. Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome and laying the foundations of the Church. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. Luke also, the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who also had leaned upon his breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. Church History, Chapter 8, Irenaeus' Remarks on the Divine Books, Eusebius of Caesarea. The Deception. The writings of Irenaeus were all lost, but a Latin translation of his 5 books, Against Heresies, was found. And an Armenian translation of his book, The Demonstration of the Apostolic Preaching, was discovered in 1904 CE. In these 2 works alone, the Church finds the elements of the Christian theological system. In other words, the Church has built its doctrine based on a Latin and an Armenian translation of the books of Irenaeus and has never seen the original. The Church even does not know who translated those books and whether they were honest in their translation or not. Moreover, the Church itself has very little information about Irenaeus himself. In his book, Against Heresies, Irenaeus claimed that when he was young, he attended sermons for a saint named Polycarp the Martyr, and that he, Polycarp, was a disciple of John the son of Zebedee, the disciple of Christ. Irenaeus also claimed that Polycarp has mentioned that the Gospel of John was written by his teacher, John, the disciple of Christ. He also claimed that Polycarp had a companion named Papias, and that Papias stated that the Gospel of Matthew was written by Matthew, the disciple of Christ, and the Gospel of Mark was written by Mark, the disciple of Peter. The New Testament, according to Irenaeus, contains the Gospel of the Shepherd of Hermas, which the Church considers it apocrypha. Thus, how did the Church believe Irenaeus regarding the canonicity of the 4 Gospels and then belie him regarding the Gospel of the Shepherd of Hermas, considering it apocrypha? Polycarps. Saint Polycarp, Bishop of Smyrna, 70–166. The Church knows nothing about him except what Irenaeus mentioned in his book, Against Heresies, that Polycarp was a disciple of John, the disciple of Christ, and he was the one who mentioned that the Gospel of John was written by John, the disciple of Christ. Thus, Polycarp is the only connection between the disciples of Christ, who lived in the 1st century, and the early Church Fathers, who lived in the 2nd century. Tertullian, 155–240, also mentioned that Polycarp was a disciple of John, but his testimony was only a quote from what Irenaeus said, because Tertullian was born 1 year before the death of Polycarp. That is, he never saw him, and therefore his testimony is not considered. Papias. The Church knows nothing about him except what Irenaeus mentioned in his book, Against Heresies, that Papias was a companion of Polycarp. He was a hearer of John, the disciple of Christ. He was a bishop of Hierapolis, and he was the one who mentioned that the Gospel of Matthew was written by Matthew and the Gospel of Mark was written by Mark, the disciple of Peter. Eusebius of Caesarea mentioned in his book, Church History, that Papias has pointed out that the writer of the Gospel of Matthew was a person named Matthew. Thus Matthew wrote the divine sayings in Hebrew, and every one interpreted them to the best of his ability. Eusebius of Caesarea also stated that Papias has pointed out that the writer of Mark's Gospel was a person named Mark who was one of Peter's disciples. Mark, being the tongue of Peter, wrote precisely, albeit in no order, everything he remembered about what Jesus said or did, because he did not listen to the Lord nor follow him, but later. As I said, he followed Peter, who made his teachings conform to the needs of his listeners, without intending to make the Lord's conversations related. The Church also knows about Papias that he wrote 5 books under the title, Interpretation of the Lord's Sayings, but these books were all lost. And only a few excerpts were recorded in the writings of Irenaeus, which also were lost. Unfortunately, the only source from which the Church derived its information about Papias was what Irenaeus claimed. Furthermore, when one of the church fathers was writing about Papias, he was only quoting what Irenaeus said about him. In his book, Church History, Eusebius of Caesarea stated, Irenaeus referred to these 5 books written by Papias as the only work written by Papias. Irenaeus said, these things are attested by Papias, an ancient man who was a hearer of John and a companion of Polycarp, in his 4th book. For 5 books have been written by him. But Papias himself in the preface to his discourses by no means declares that he was himself a hearer and eyewitness of the holy apostles. But he shows by the words which he uses that he received the doctrines of the faith from those who were friends of the apostles. Church History of Eusebius, Chapter XXXIX, The Writings of Papias. Eterna Press. 12. As we can see, Eusebius himself belied what Irenaeus said regarding Papias. What Irenaeus said, Papias, an ancient man, and a companion of Polycarp, suggests that he was telling a fairy tale, in which he tried to identify someone who is already unknown. And this makes us question the existence of a person named Papias. There is no evidence of his existence nor his writings nor that he was a disciple of John, the disciple of Christ, but the claim of Irenaeus. Has Papias ever had any companions or disciples? Is there any church had heard about him during his lifetime and not only through the writings of Irenaeus? Is it logical that such a person of such importance and prestige neither was famous nor his writings were widespread among churches? Even the excerpts quoted by Irenaeus in his writings and ascribed them to Papias, assume that Irenaeus had the writings of Papias in his hand to quote them. Nevertheless, as long as those books were never preserved, and no one mentioned its existence except Irenaeus, then they never existed at all. And those excerpts were from the thought of Irenaeus himself. In his book, Church History, Eusebius of Caesarea stated, the same writer, Papias, gives also other accounts which he says came to him through unwritten tradition, certain strange parables and teachings of the Savior, and some other more mythical things. To these belong his statement that there will be a period of some 1,000 years after the resurrection of the dead, and that the kingdom of Christ will be set up in material form on this very earth. I suppose he got these ideas through a misunderstanding of the apostolic accounts, not perceiving that the things said by them were spoken mystically in figures. For he appears to have been of very limited understanding, as one can see from his discourses. But it was due to him that so many of the church fathers after him adopted a like opinion, urging in their own support the antiquity of the man. As for instance, Irenaeus and anyone else that may have proclaimed similar views. Church History of Eusebius, Chapter XXXIX, The Writings of Papias. Eterna Press. As we can see, that Eusebius criticized Papias and blamed him for the following things. 1. Papias merged in Christianity strange parables and teachings and some other more mythical things as part of the oral tradition. 2. Papias appears to have been of minimal understanding, as one can see from his discourses. 3. Papias was a chiliast or millennialist, millennialism, the millennial kingdom, believing that there will be a period of some 1,000 years after the resurrection of the dead, and that the kingdom of Christ will be set up in material form on this very earth. For due to Papias so many of the church fathers after him adopted a like opinion and became millennialists, for instance, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr's, St. Justin Martyr, Latin, Lustinus Martyr 100-165, 14, Tertullian, Methodius of Olympus, and others. The millennial kingdom. The millennial kingdom belief is a literal interpretation of the book of Revelation, that Christ would return to earth to rule for 1,000 years. And his believers would rise among the dead, which is called the first resurrection, to rule with him for 1,000 years. While others will rise from the dead only at the last great resurrection, and the wicked would perish and peace would spread in that millennium. In fact, the millennial kingdom belief was derived from the Jewish apocrypha writings that were written 1 or 2 centuries before Christ. This belief prevailed in most Christian churches, but few church fathers resisted that belief, such as Origen of Alexandria, c. 184 c. 253, Dionysius of Alexandria, Saint Dionysius of Alexandria, Eusebius of Caesarea, Basil of Caesarea, c. 330 c. 379, Gregory of Nyssa, c. 335 c. 395, also Saint Augustine of Hippo, St. Augustine of Hippo, c. 354, c.430. 15 resisted that heresy and considered that anyone who believed in the doctrine of Papias is deviant from faith. Later, the doctrine of the Orthodox and the Catholic Church regarding the millennial kingdom was changed and became that the millennial kingdom belief must be understood in its symbolic rather than literal sense, and that kingdom had already begun from the time of Christ, and the present church is the kingdom of Christ on earth. As for the Protestant Church, to this day, it still believes in the millennial kingdom literally. Back to the figure of Papias, was he a real figure or just a figment of Irenaeus' imagination? Responding to this, Irenaeus has claimed that Papias had heard the millennial kingdom in its literal sense from John, the disciple of Christ, whereas the early church stated that this is heresy and there is no millennial kingdom in its literal sense. Therefore, as long as it is unreasonable that John, the disciple of Christ, had mentioned such heresy. So, what Irenaeus had said about Papias was just a myth, and Papias was just an imaginary figure of the imagination of Irenaeus that never exist in reality. The question that arises now is, why did Irenaeus may lie and fabricate fictitious figures that are Polycarp and Papias, claiming that they were hearers of John, the disciple of Christ, and then ascribing to them that they mentioned that the Gospel of John was written by John, the disciple of Christ? The answer is, Irenaeus was most resistant to what he called heresies that appeared in the 2nd century. In his responses to these heresies, Irenaeus relied primarily on John's Gospel. Thus, he likely attributed falsely this Gospel to John, the disciple of Christ. Then made up the character of Polycarp and claimed that Polycarp was his teacher and that Polycarp was a disciple of John, the disciple of Christ. He likely made this to make his argument before people appear the right one and to prove the doctrine that he considers the right one and refutes the arguments of other priests that oppose his idea. And methodology. One may say, it is unreasonable that Irenaeus could lie such an unforgivable lie, ascribing an unknown gospel to John, the disciple of Christ, creating illusory figures such as Polycarp and Papias. The answer is, the theologians affirm that early Christians did not believe that to ascribe an anonymous gospel to a disciple is an act that involves deception or fraud. Whoever did that act did not feel that he was lying regarding Christ or the faith, but rather, he felt that he was lying for the sake of Christ and for affirming the doctrine that he believed to be the right one. At the time that Irenaeus was holding a gospel in his hand and attributed it to John, the disciple of Christ, many senior priests were holding many other gospels in their hands and attributed them to the disciples of Christ. Irenaeus was criticizing those other gospels, mentioning that they are apocrypha, and its attribution to the disciples of Christ is a forgery. Thus, whoever says that it is unreasonable that Irenaeus could lie such an unforgivable lie, ascribing an unknown gospel to John, the disciple of Christ, is supporting without realizing Irenaeus and opposing his opponents, who were also senior priests. In other words, he is accusing them of lying and that they ascribed forgery gospels that were in their hands to the disciples of Christ, without having heard neither their arguments nor the arguments of Irenaeus, and without having any real knowledge about any of them. Summary of this chapter. 1. The Church has little information about Irenaeus. 2. The Church has no copies of the books of Irenaeus. 3. The Church has based its doctrine and information regarding the 4 Gospel scribes on a Latin and Armenian translation of the books of Irenaeus. 4. The Church neither know who translated those books, nor if they were trustworthy. 5. Both Polycarp and Papias are unknown figures, and none of the early Church Fathers knew them, except Irenaeus. 6. Eusebius of Caesarea stated that Papias was a man of very little intelligence, who believed in the millennial kingdom heresy in its literal sense and inserted in Christianity strange parables and teachings and some other more mythical things as part of the oral tradition. 7. St. Augustine considered that anyone believes in the doctrine of Papias is deviant from faith.